to look at a part of the Christmas story now. We're going to be talking, I lit the candle earlier for representing love, and that's the theme of our service today, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. Jessica's going to come and read a passage for us. It's a very famous passage. If you want to come on up, Jessica, let me get the microphone for you. Very famous passage about, from Matthew's second chapter, about the Magi coming and all that. She's going to read it. I think one of the challenges with Christmas and hearing these readings is they're so familiar to us, okay, because we've heard it all before. So let's try, to whatever degree we can, as we listen to this, to listen to it with fresh ears, to listen to it perhaps as though we've never heard it before. That's impossible to do, but let's try to hear with fresh ears the best we can.
Good morning. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more." After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who are trying to take the child's life are dead." So he got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene.
Great. Thanks so much, Jessica. By the way, Jessica has just had her first novel published. I mean, she didn't know I was going to say this. Let me go down. Number 7. Great stocking stuffer. Okay, just a little hint. She didn't know I was going to say that. So, but that's a great accomplishment. Amazing accomplishment. Okay, so as we were listening to that, anything strike us? Perhaps something that stuck out to you that you've not noticed before. Something that occurred to you for the first time. Anybody want to share anything from that reading? Very familiar reading, obviously, very familiar story, but we'll have to do it all on my own. Okay, yeah, Pete, just shout it out. I'm not going to take the mic round.
This guy had a star.
Oh, he had a star. Okay, yeah, pretty unusual. Anybody else? Anything that sort of? Yes.
I think it's interesting that our Constitution, they get warnings because they're dreams.
A lot of dreams, right? Yeah. Okay. Anything else?
That he said every boy 2 years old and younger, and I didn't never think he was at least 2 years old.
Right, so there's an edict to kill the male babies under 2 years old, and so it sounds like Jesus is a little, potentially at least a little older, maybe the Magi came along a little later. Yeah, Kenny?
Yeah, I think that Star was an old-fashioned GPS.
An old-fashioned GPS, maybe it was. Maybe, yeah. Steve? Right, lots of prophecy, lots of prophecy. Okay, so different things standing out there. Let me make a few comments, and then we'll dig into the passage a little bit. Along the lines of some of the things that people have said, I think to me, what strikes me about this passage, and we've certainly said this before about the Christmas story in general, is that it's a real mixture, right? We've got the mysterious, magical, some people might say rainbows and unicorns kind of part of the story, right? Stars and dreams and all these sort of miraculous things, which we tend to portray in cards and Christmas cards and that kind of thing. Not many Christmas cards portray the massacre of the innocents, right? Okay, so alongside all this magical, more cuddly stuff and the wonder, is this really gritty story. I mean, for instance, we just read a story which included the massacre of every male baby under the age of 2, and this isn't being critical, but it didn't really come up as when we were mentioning it. That was a big deal. Probably because we've talked about it before, right? We've read it so many times, so we're sort of immune to it. But there's this really terrible, harsh, difficult part to the story, as well as this miraculous, more cuddly side to the story, if you like. Okay, so that's one thing to bear in mind. And maybe, as we think about familiarity and how familiarity can actually maybe filter things out for us and cause us to read the story in an inappropriate way, perhaps that mixture is, seeing the mixture is a way of us sort of getting more into the story, more alert to what's going on. The other thing is, as somebody mentioned this as well, a lot of prophecy, right? There's dreams, people having dreams and being warned about things, but also the writer of Matthew here is sort of bending over backwards to explain that Jesus fulfills this kind of prophecy, that kind of prophecy. I mean, it's dotted in, even in just that chapter, and the whole of the book of Matthew actually is full of this, where Matthew, the writer of Matthew, is trying to say, look, Jesus fulfills Hebrew prophecy. Matthew is a very Hebrew book, a very Jewish book. And so it's really important that he makes the point that Jesus fulfills Hebrew prophecy about the Messiah, about different things the Messiah would do, etc., etc. Now, it seems actually at times like he's kind of stretching the point. For instance, he ends up there explaining that Jesus ends up in Nazareth. Okay, so interestingly, according to Matthew, Jesus could have been from Bethlehem, and that's why he was born in Bethlehem, whereas Luke has Jesus from Nazareth originally, and then because of the edict of the Roman Empire, Mary and Joseph have to go to Nazareth go to Bethlehem because that's the hometown, the family hometown of Joseph. Well, Matthew kind of tells the story slightly differently, but he makes the point at the end that Jesus comes back to Nazareth, and he says, therefore, that fulfills the prophecy that Jesus would be, or the Messiah would be a Nazarene. Well, the Nazarene prophecy isn't a prophecy about coming from Nazareth. It's to do with a sort of a particular religious sect within Judaism. So he's kind of stretching the point. That would be like saying, the Messiah would be a washer of cars because they're from Washington. It's like, what? That doesn't really work. But so now, I think that what we can conclude from this is that Matthew is trying to tell us a story. Matthew's trying to make a point. He's kind of performing some gymnastics and kind of weaving Hebrew prophecy in. And at times it might seem a bit of a stretch, but it's because Matthew has a message for us, a really clear message. Or a message that perhaps isn't so clear because it's become so familiar, and perhaps because we've lost some of the context for it. So we're just going to try and examine what that message might be. Now, I think there's multiple messages in there. There's multiple things we could talk about. We could talk about the Magi coming from a non-Jewish culture, and they're coming to worship the Jewish Messiah. I mean, there's outsiders are included. We could talk about all the different things that the prophecies represent, or the amazing way in which God speaks to people through dreams and that kind of thing. But what I want to focus in on today is this issue of, it's more of a sociological issue, really, and that is this, that in this story, the writer of Matthew seems to be trying to show us that there are two very distinct sociological groups. There is a group of privilege and a group that is oppressed. Okay, so And I think when we look at it, it's pretty obvious that, but maybe we don't see so clearly how strongly Matthew is trying to communicate this message to us. The group of privilege is represented by Herod. Okay, so if you read Luke's gospel, we hear much more about the Romans. All right, but the Romans had kind of puppet leaders in place, local leaders in place. Rome was the empire, and they appointed local leaders to rule. It was kind of a divide and conquer tactic of theirs. And so they had Herod, who was the king of the Jews, in charge of this particular part of their empire, the area of Palestine. And Herod was, we read in the story, Herod eventually dies and has children, and his little mini empire is split up amongst his children. And they had a really bad reputation for how they treated people. They were pretty austere leaders, very greedy, very dictatorial. Not unlike the Romans in many respects, I guess. So that group, that sociological group, the group of privilege and power, is represented by Herod. But Herod's not alone. Do you remember what it said that when Herod heard the news, the Magi come to Herod, they say, "Hey, where's the king of the Jews?" Now, when you are the king of the Jews, and you have a bunch of people from miles away who have sort of studied the stars and come and say, "We've heard the king of the Jews has been born, can you tell us where he is?" That's going to freak you out, right, if that's your title. And of course he's freaked out, but he's not the only one that's freaked out. It says, well, can anybody remember what it said about Herod and who else was freaked out? The whole of Jerusalem, right. I mean, it says that, the whole of Jerusalem, or it says in more biblical language, and all of Jerusalem together with him, because that sounds much better. But it means the whole of Jerusalem. So this was a systemic thing. This was a system, if you like. This wasn't an individual. This was a system of privilege and power. And then somebody else mentioned, he calls together some significant people, the high priest or the priests, and the teachers of the law, so the religious powers. He calls them together to say, hey, what's the deal with this, all these prophecies and all the rest of it? So, here's Herod, but he represents a much bigger system of power and privilege. And that system executes power ruthlessly. When that power is threatened, when privilege is threatened, there's a violent reaction, a horrendous violent reaction, where every male baby under the age of 2 is killed just to try and catch the one. Okay, so Matthew's telling that very austere story right at the beginning, that horrific story right at the beginning of his whole book. It's pretty shocking. Now the other group is the group of people who are oppressed. And Jesus is in that group, right? That group is represented by Jesus. Jesus is somebody who's oppressed in multiple ways. From other parts of the story, we realize he was from a very poor family. His parents had to go and travel when his mother was heavily pregnant because of an edict of a dictatorship, a Roman dictatorship. But in this story, we see that the oppression takes on a much more sinister form, a much more specific form, where they try to kill him. They try to kill Jesus. And so they sort of hunt Jesus down, kill all these other babies just to try and catch Jesus. And Jesus, as an oppressed person, has to flee to another country. Where does Jesus flee to? Where does his family flee to? Can you remember from the story? To Egypt, right, to Egypt. And Matthew makes the point, so he came back. So, there's a prophecy about the Messiah, that the Messiah would come out of Egypt. So Matthew's making the point that, okay, Jesus is fulfilling that prophecy. But there's actually, I think, deeper meaning in that Jesus going to Egypt than that. We'll come on to that in a second. There's some irony there and some much deeper meaning. So here is Jesus representing the oppressed group. Now, what's, I think, fascinating about the story, what's incredible about the story, what's shocking about the story, and again, it's probably not that shocking to us now, because we've read it so many times, is that if we believe that Jesus is the incarnation of God, if we believe that Jesus is God incarnate, right, which is what we're celebrating at Christmas, then God comes into the oppressed group. God decides to side with the oppressed. God decides to be in a situation that is vulnerable because of not having power, because of not having privilege. That the privileged, powerful group could actually undermine everything that God wanted to do in with whatever God had in mind in bringing Jesus. Okay, we'll see that all unfolded as we read on in Matthew and the other Gospels. But all of that was at risk because God came into a vulnerable group of people. God came into the oppressed. Okay, so at Christmas, we are celebrating Jesus, God, siding very deliberately, very graphically, very vividly, very audaciously with the oppressed. Now that doesn't mean that God is against the privilege. It just means that God is siding with the oppressed. And as one who is impressed, here's the irony, as one who is impressed, Jesus flees into Egypt. Now what does Egypt represent in Hebrew culture? If you read the Hebrew scriptures, for instance, what does Egypt represent? Slavery, okay, oppression. So here's the irony, that to escape Hebrew oppression, Jesus has to flee to Egypt, the sort of historic and representative form of oppression in Hebrew culture. If you read the Old Testament, read the Hebrew scriptures, frequently, particularly the prophets, will quote God as saying, I brought you out of Egypt, I brought you out of Egypt, frequently reminding the people that I set you free, I saved you, I was on your side, I was with you when you were oppressed, and as a reminder of God's love and care. So Egypt represents oppression. And here is Jesus going to the source of oppression in order to escape oppression. It's like the oppressees, those who have been oppressed, the Hebrew people, have now become the oppressors. And obviously we see that played out in history very frequently. But here's Jesus going to Egypt. Now, because Jesus goes to Egypt, Jesus has to come out of Egypt, right? And Matthew makes this big point that his family came from Egypt and then eventually landed in Nazareth. Now, there's a prophetic connection to that, obviously. Out of Egypt will I call my son. That's quoted in Matthew. But what's the other connection? Who else in Hebrew history comes out of Egypt? I mean, what does that sound like? Okay, let me just give you maybe a little clue here. If I was running for US president, which I am not, and I can't, I wasn't born in this country, so I can't, but just imagine for a moment that I was. And as one of my sort of campaign acts, I got in a boat and crossed the Delaware River. Okay? Who would that sound like? Lincoln? George Washington, right? Have I got my history wrong? I think it's George Washington. Yeah, George Washington. Okay, so there's that famous act, George Washington crossing the Delaware to fight somebody. I don't know who that was, but anyway, he's crossing the river. And so that's iconic, right? It's iconic. Okay, and so I would be kind of being compared, or be comparing myself to Washington by doing that. Who else came out of Egypt? Moses, right? Moses came out of Egypt. So here is Jesus. I mean, maybe I'm just inventing this, just connecting the dots that aren't there. Here's Jesus, like a second Moses coming out of Egypt. Well, you might say, well, that's a bit far-fetched. Well, there's something else in the story that's a bit Moses-like, right? What else in the story we just read is comparable to the story of Moses? Sorry? The death threat, okay, the massacre of the children. So if we think about our history, so the Hebrew people were enslaved in Egypt. What did the privileged, powerful empire of Egypt do to contain the Hebrew population? They had every firstborn male killed, right? Every Hebrew firstborn male killed. So the midwives had to kill those babies, let them die. And Moses was hidden away, right, whisked away for protection. A little bit like the Jesus story, and then comes back. And so there's some comparisons. Matthew seems to be leading us to believe that Jesus is the second Moses. Now, that continues on throughout the book of Moses. I don't think I'm making it up because, not the book of Moses, the book of Matthew. When you read the book of Matthew, frequently Jesus is compared to Moses, or stories are told about Jesus that make him look like Moses. For instance, in chapter 5, he walks up a mountain and declares God's law. Right? He actually reinterprets the law in the Sermon on the Mount. Just like Moses went up a mountain and got the Ten Commandments, right? And Moses was the lawgiver. Jesus is bringing a different kind of law, a reinterpretation of the law. All right, so Jesus is like the second Moses. Now, who was Moses? What did Moses do? What was his role for the people of Israel? If you were to think of one word to describe... Has anybody seen the movie, by the way? That's a genuine question. Has anybody seen it?
Yeah.
Well, no, everybody's too busy, I guess. It looks like a good movie, but what did Moses do? Liberator, right? Moses is a liberator. He's a liberator of enslaved people. He's a liberator of the oppressed. So if Jesus is being compared to Moses, then Jesus not only is being associated with the oppressed, like Jesus is in the oppressed group, God is siding with the oppressed, but not only that, Jesus has come as liberator. Jesus is going to set oppressed people free. Oppression is going to be defeated. That seems to be one of, I'm not saying the only one, but one of the core messages of this Christmas story as told by Matthew. Now we have to think about this, I think, in very seriously and allow it to challenge us. Because again, we come back to this whole issue of familiarity. We're so familiar with the story that it works against us, right? Our familiarity doesn't help us because it's just not that shocking. It's just not that, whoa, what's going on here? We're used to that. Secondly, for most of us, not all of us in this room, but for most of us, we are actually in the privileged group. Right? For most of us, we've lived in a society where society has worked for us. Society has worked to our advantage. I mean, we've all had ups and downs, and we've all had challenges, and we probably all have things that we want to complain about. But on the whole, things have been set up such that we've been able to take advantage of opportunities that have come our way. We've had a head start. We've had support. But that hasn't been true for everybody in our culture all the time. And I think, for instance, I'm just going to pick on one part of our community in the USA. The African American community are hurting really badly at the moment, particularly over these deaths that have happened, and the feeling of unfairness and injustice that has been going on, not just recently, but been going on for centuries. And a feeling that actually the system doesn't work for me. I'm not in a position of privilege. Now, if we are in a position of privilege, we hear, I think, that kind of sentiment as political, as it might make us afraid. It might make us angry. It might make us feel, well, even guilty. You know, we feel, well, or that actually where we've got today isn't down to our own merits, but down to all these different privileges. And it can make us feel really insecure. It can make us feel like we want to push back against it. We don't really want to believe it. I think the call of Christmas to us is to think through this. To what degree does our privilege blind us from seeing Jesus for who he really is? To what degree does our privilege blind us from seeing oppression for what it really is? To what degree does our privilege inhibit us from really understanding injustice? Because injustice is something that's so hard to understand when we're not subject to it ourselves. And not only that, but can at Christmas, can we receive the challenge of Jesus, the challenge of Christmas, to side with the oppressed? To say, right, we're going to stand with oppressed people. No matter where we're from, no matter whether we're from privileged or less privileged backgrounds, whatever it is, and no matter what our political views are, no matter all that stuff, and I'm not in any way saying politics is bad. I mean, you know, many good things happen through political action. But I'm just saying for a moment, if we could just put our politics aside and say, what does it mean for us to stand with the oppressed? To stand with people who've experienced the kind of enslavement that the Hebrew people had experienced, who have experienced the kind of oppression that the Hebrew people had experienced, who maybe the Hebrew people who were not in power at that time could understand that God would come to the oppressed, because they were being oppressed by the Romans, oppressed by the Hebrew authorities, oppressed by the religious authorities, and they were crying out for help. The message of Christmas is, help has come. And so I wonder if we could just at least open our hearts to that challenge, to say, what does it mean for us to stand with the oppressed? And that might mean being open-minded and saying, God, I don't understand it all. You know, when we think of what's going on in our culture at the moment. And believe me, I have my own views, right? You know, and I try to be fair in not using this platform or this spotlight just to spout my own views. You probably know where I'm coming from. I'm a European, right? So, you probably, what I mean is you probably know where I'm coming from politically to some degree. And I could say exactly what I think about what's going on in the culture right now, and some people would go home very angry at me, and some people would go home, yes, that's right, that's great, and I'm not sure how much that accomplishes. But can we, as followers of Jesus, see Jesus as with the oppressed? God coming into a situation and saying, okay, I could choose this sphere of influence here. If I come into the powerful, privileged arena, just think of the influence I could have. Just think of what I could change. And that could have been the plan. And clearly the Magi expected that to be the plan. They've interpreted the stars and they've worked out the King of the Jews is being born. So where do they go? Jerusalem to the royal court. I mean, why not? Where else would you go? And they're totally confused because actually God chose a different route, and Jesus is born into a really humble family and is actually the victim of that privileged group here, who are so afraid and so upset and so insecure. Could we just open our hearts to receive that challenge, uncomfortable as it may be? Can we stand with those that we know who are part of groups of people that have been oppressed through centuries, through years, maybe even just recently? I mean, there's all sorts of different groups of people that we are connected with. Maybe it's people who are immigrants. Maybe it's whoever it might be, people who, for whatever reason, do not feel that the system is working for them in the same kind of way that it has worked perhaps for some others of us. As we come, we're going to have communion. And as we come to communion, we're going to drink bread and wine, as we've done for centuries, as followers of Jesus. But that bread and wine was drunk centuries before Jesus. Jesus took bread and wine at the Passover, right? That's when he celebrated with his disciples, and he kind of imbued the Passover with new meaning, and we celebrate that now. But the Passover, of course, was this annual festival where the people of Israel celebrated their freedom. They celebrated having been liberated. They celebrated having been liberated from slavery and tyranny, and it was like a mark to say, God is with us, God cares about us, God's with us. And we're celebrating at Christmas, God with us, Emmanuel, God with us. So as we come to the table, we're saying, God, you're with us. You're with us. And Jesus, when he breaks the bread and pours the wine, Jesus is really entering into the Passover, again, kind of like a Moses figure, like a liberator. Jesus is taking on the Passover, this festival of liberation, and giving liberation away. And not only that, inviting his followers into the goal, the task of liberation, of overcoming oppression. He's really saying, guys, I am standing here as one who is oppressed and one who has come to overturn oppression. And I'm inviting you into that same process. Would you join with me in that process? Would you become co-laborers in this work? And so as we come to the table, as we drink bread and wine, that's what we're doing. We're entering into this kind of Passover sentiment of liberation. Now we can come in one of two ways. We can come as people who need liberation. That's true for all of us. We all have things that we carry that weigh us down. All right, at a very individual level. We might come as somebody weighed down with psychological issues, emotional issues, maybe guilt, shame, all sorts of things that we can come here and say, Jesus, would you take that? Would you relieve me of this oppression? Would you help me to experience your forgiveness through this act of taking bread and wine? We might also come as oppressed people who feel very much that we've not been born into privilege, that things aren't always for us, that we've had to struggle, and we kind of feel that struggle. And it hurts, and we're in pain, and we may feel that others in our society just don't understand that pain. And it feels hard, and we can come this morning to one who understands our pain, one who's with us, one who's not pointing the finger or tutting or anything like that, but saying, I'm with you in this. I am oppressed. I'm standing with the oppressed. Okay, so we come with our oppression to the table, but we also come to receive the invitation to be liberators, to be Jesus-like, to be Moses-like. And we're going to talk more about this after Christmas. We're going to begin a series in January on the book of Amos, and we're going to talk about what does it really look like? What does it mean? How seriously does God take this? But for now, we could just come with open hearts and say, God, soften my heart. Help me to see and understand oppression. If we feel we're coming from a perspective where we've experienced privilege in our lives, then we can ask God, God, help me see beyond that. Help take those scales from my eyes. Help me to empathize. Help me to see so that I can stand with those that are oppressed. So that I can not just pat people on the head and feel sorry for people, but I can actually stand with people as my brothers, as my sisters. And we can accept that invitation this morning. So I'm going to pray, and then please do come forward. You can help yourself here. There's bread and wine. It's non-alcoholic wine. Gluten-free bread is also available at the front here. And then you can also be served at the sides. So please do go there if you like to. We have candles that you can light at the sides here. They're not at the back today, but at the sides. There's places you can write a prayer just on the side there, and places also that you can make an offering. You know, Steve was talking about our financial needs. There's towers at the back and offering stations around the room. So, lots of things we can do. We're just going to sing another carol together while we're having communion. But let's pray. And in fact, why don't we just stand together?